Hey, Steve Saretsky here. Welcome back to the show. I want to touch on two topics today that I'm following quite closely. Lots of attention to it in the media this week. Number one is immigration here in Canada. Number two is CPI inflation. We had some numbers, important numbers that came out from the US this week, and we've got Canada coming out next week. So I want to walk through all of that and the implications for markets here moving forward. But I think we really have to talk first and foremost on the immigration side. I've been talking about a lot on this channel for the last couple of years, before it sort of went mainstream media, really questioning the levels of immigration and whether or not they are appropriate given the existing housing crisis that we've been facing. The Canada has been adding 1 million people a year for the last 2 years. Okay, this is the highest rate of population growth since the 1950s. And again, I want to remind everybody that we've seen this ballooning house prices, ballooning rent growth, the pressure on existing infrastructure, think about hospitals, medical care, etc. And so you start to wonder, well, like, why is nobody asking these hard questions around immigration and population growth? And is this the right number? We all know that Canada is built on immigration. We need immigration. Nobody's sitting here denying that, certainly not myself. But you have to ask yourself, is 1 million people a year, is that the right number? Are we missing something? And so it seemed like no media was willing to touch on it. 2-3 years ago, it was considered xenophobic. You couldn't even ask the question. And it's only now, as we get closer and closer to this next federal election, and as more people start to come out and say, hey, hold on a minute, yeah, something isn't quite right. Now the media is suddenly starting to report on it. It's okay to ask questions. And I wonder if that has to do with some of the polling around immigration. All we have to do is look at recent Nanos data polling showing that the majority of Canadians are now suggesting that they believe that immigration numbers should be reduced. And so again, now all of a sudden we're asking the hard questions. Is 1 million people a year the right number? And we had an article out this week that shows that through the freedom of press investigations, it was discovered that the government 2 years ago was advised that the current levels of immigration were going to be problematic, and particularly on the infrastructure side, aka housing, and they basically ignored it. Now, keep in mind that the immigration minister at the time, 2 years ago, for example, was Sean Fraser. Sean Fraser is now the housing minister. So the guy that kind of created the problem or helped turn a blind eye to the problem, is now the guy responsible for solving the problem that he helped exacerbate, which is the housing side of it. And so I'm not going to say that this is intentional. I'm not willing to say that yet, but I do wonder that these people are they really that naive or that dumb to not think that this is going to be a problem? And so again, now we finally got the media asking questions. They did ask Krista Freeland, the finance minister, this week what her thoughts were. So let's clip to that clip right now.
Documents obtained by Canadian press show your government was warned that housing construction had not kept up with population growth, largely because of Canada's immigration targets. Why did your government not heed that warning and lower immigration levels?
Thank you for the question, Simon. And let me say this. As a country, Canada is probably the country in the world which is the most welcoming of new Canadians, which is the most welcoming of immigrants. And as finance minister, I have to say that is a huge economic strength. It is a real driver of our country's economic growth. And at a time when all of the industrialized countries in the world are facing huge demographic challenges, we are extremely fortunate as a country that we have the social capacity to welcome immigrants. You are quite right that if we want to be a country that welcomes new Canadians, and I strongly believe that's the right thing for all of us, we have to build more homes faster. And that's one of the reasons I'm here. Our government is totally committed to getting more homes built for Canadians. You have seen that unrelenting focus for weeks and weeks and weeks, for months and months and months.
So you notice that Krista Freeland, she still has not denounced the levels of immigration. She's come out and said, we just need to build more housing. She never really has come out and says, yes, you know what, you're right, million people a year, it was a mistake, we should probably look to lower it. You know, maybe we should tie housing completions to population growth. No, she just says, we're just going to ramp up new housing supply. And again, if you guys have been following this channel, which a lot of you have, you know my current thoughts on that. We do need to ramp up new housing supply. But there is a natural limit on your ability to ramp up construction. It's like, it's not easy to build homes. You need skilled labor. You're at the mercy of not only labor, but commodity markets, right? You know, if everybody just starts building more homes, you know, more lumber, more concrete, that starts to go up. And so the ability to actually source all of these trades and materials and ramp it up. I mean, like I said, right now the math is we're immigrating 1 million people a year, and we're completing. We're actually like finishing housing. We're finishing 250,000 homes on average a year. In fact, it's closer to about 225,000, but like, let's just call it 250. Keep the numbers simple. That's a very obvious mismatch. I mean, that's 4 people per household when the household composition in Canada is about 2.1 people. So we're asking basically double the amount of people to go into one home. It just, the numbers. So even if you can ramp up housing supply, let's just say interest rates came back down, the numbers, the economics of it, made sense again for developers to actually put shovels in the ground, and financing was cheap and readily available because the economic conditions are so great. I'm not convinced that you're going to be able to ramp up housing completions, you know, from 250 to maybe that number hits 350. You know, we're not going to go from 250 to 500,000, which is basically what we need, assuming you're adding 1 million people a year. So again, it kind of just like, I just don't understand. I really wonder what is going on here. On the flip side, you know, people say, well, what's the alternative? You know, finally we've got some messaging out from the conservative side. So Pierre Poilievre came out this week saying that assuming he was to be elected, they would look at tying the levels of immigration to housing completions or to housing starts. And so again, tying that number to the level of immigration so you can actually support the people that are coming in. Of course, we know these tent cities popping up all across Canada. So I'm kind of closely monitoring that. If anyone's paying attention outside of Canada, it's a little bit odd. It's a little bit odd that all of these countries are reporting an immigration crisis or an immigration problem. You know, you're reading about all the stuff that's happening in the U.S., all these illegal immigrants. In fact, in New York, for example, they are shutting down schools. They're shutting down local elementary schools because they need the schools to house the illegal immigrants in the country. You're like, man, that's odd. That's weird. So you got that going on in the U.S. You got immigration issues in Europe. You've got these immigration problems. Just Google, like, you know, immigration crisis Australia, and all these articles and commentary about what's happening there. And you're like, man, it's a weird coincidence that all of these countries are having this sudden surge and boom in sort of immigrants and all the issues that are coming with that. So again, I'm kind of closely monitoring that because I really look at it and say, somebody had to know here in Canada that the numbers were out of control on top of an existing housing crisis. So again, we'll be closely monitoring that. On the flip side, the other big important thing for housing here in this country is interest rates, and that was ultimately tied to inflation. So we had the all-important US CPI print. The expectation was for year-over-year CPI to come in at 3.2. It came in at 3.4, so it beat. Everyone's all worried, but the bond market wasn't worried. The bond market, in fact, was basically flat on the day. Today it's down because we had producer price index came in lower the following day, and so the market is still of the view that inflation has peaked, it's going to continue to roll over, and that the Fed is going to cut rates no matter what. Now, I will say this, everyone's kind of cherry picking all these different charts and data points to sort of fit the narrative that they think that we live in. So I don't have strong conviction on this. I'm going to be honest, I don't have a very strong conviction today on inflation and interest rates in the very near term. I think we're going lower in the near term. Over the medium term, I do worry that inflation comes back. Now, the Fed does watch core PCE. Core PCE is the metric that they monitor. So they're not looking necessarily at headline CPI. They're looking at core PCE. So right now, core PCE is annualizing about 2%. Okay, so based on that number, if you're looking at that number, if you're the Fed, this is why the market still thinks that they're going to be cutting. In fact, if you look at how the markets are positioning and pricing for rate cuts, they're of the view that the Fed is going to cut for the next seven consecutive meetings starting in March. 7 consecutive rate cuts starting in March from the Fed. I think that's optimistic. That's not my view, but again, I'm going to be honest. I don't have a strong conviction right now. I just think that the current levels of rates are too high for a highly indebted global economy, particularly here in Canada. But nothing has officially broken yet. And so, you start to wonder, what is the basis for cutting rates? I mean, obviously, rates, it's a tough one. I just don't have a lot of conviction here moving forward, but this is what the markets are telling you about how they're positioning. And so we'll wait and see. And this is going to be really the driver and the dictator of how Canadian housing, for example, performs this year. If you get mortgage rates into the 4s, and particularly, mid to low 4s, you're going to have a strong and resilient housing market this year. It doesn't mean you're going to get, a whole bunch of price growth, but you're going to see a lot of housing. You're going to see housing volume. Get closer back to more normal levels, as opposed to what we saw here in Vancouver, right? 20% below the long-term average in the GTA in Toronto. 23-year lows. That's really weak sales activity. You get mortgages back into the 4s. Rates come down. Bank of Canada cuts rates. 50, 75, 100, 125 basis points. You will get a significant uptick in housing activity as people come off the sidelines, and there's a sense of urgency, which I would again like to emphasize, that the housing market trades off of sentiment. Most people, in my experience, interacting with hundreds of home buyers and sellers every single year, most people don't live in a spreadsheet. Most people aren't watching global macro and saying, okay, this could happen in the Middle East to impact inflation, and there could be a recession. Like, that's not how most people think when they operate. They just say, I heard from my neighbor, I heard from my uncle that housing prices are going to start going up. I heard that interest rates are going to go down. I should buy. The payment I can afford is X. That's how most people start to operate. And then they see open houses busy. They go, oh, wow, people are back out. And there's a sense of urgency. And that's the sentiment on the housing front. And it's the reverse. When the housing market freezes up, they hear, oh, hey, I heard prices are going to drop. I shouldn't buy. This is not a good time to buy. It's always going to go lower. So housing is very sentiment driven. And so I think just the notion of, hey, rate cuts are coming. They're starting to move lower. It does get things moving again. So we'll see. But can you imagine a scenario where, okay, the rate cuts do come? You get some rate cuts here in the spring. Your fixed rate mortgage bond yields continue to push lower into, driving your fixed rate mortgages into the fours. And then housing starts to take off and you get more activity. And then do you create a second inflationary impulse sometime this year? Maybe it's Q3, maybe it's Q4, maybe it's Q1 next year. I don't know. So does that then prompt them back to the table? This is something I'll be watching moving forward. I think it's important for everybody to pay attention to. Expect Canada's CPI headline inflation to pop a little bit higher here as the data is released next week. That's likely going to be on the base effects side of things, but I don't think it's going to deter the BOC moving forward. But again, we'll continue to monitor this. Again, I don't have a strong conviction. I don't think really anyone should in this very highly unpredictable market that we're experiencing right now, and in particular over the last 18 months. But as always, we'll be paying close attention to it, reporting it every single week. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.